Now, there's a little story I know about you, and this may tell us a lot about how we understand words and translation. You first came to Australia and you were standing outside and there was a no standing sign. But what did that mean to you?
That's a very good question, and that's a very good story to start with. I came in 1988, and back then in China there was no private car, so there was no such a thing as you drive by yourself. So when I saw that sign, no standing, I instantly related to pedestrian because there was no distinguish.
So you thought you couldn't keep standing?
Yes,
so what
because
did you do?
I thought the sign was for the pedestrian, and that was a bus stop. And I thought, because I understood English, so that's what I understood. And so, no standing, what am I supposed to do? But this is the bus stop that I have to get on the bus to Sydney University. And coincidentally, there was no one there.
So you started walking up and down?
Yes, because I thought, you can see that no one was there because they are asked not to be standing. So I thought, okay, I'll keep walking down and until the bus came, and then I jumped into the bus.
And that's an interesting story because it tells us that translation is context. And so now as a translator, how do you take a word that may mean something in one language, translate it to another, but also understand context?
That is so true. So you can see the mistake I make is also because I forgot about the target. The target is for the driver, not for the pedestrian. So language, to start with, I mean, people often say translation. Translation is actually not about finding equivalents because there are no equivalents without difference, and equivalence is not a replication.
And what's the difficulty, particularly when you're not just translating, say, from English to French or German, but an entirely different tradition, a different written tradition? If you're translating from English to Chinese, there are not going to be words that directly translate.
Never, actually. So translation is not about translate what is said. It's actually translate what is meant. Because even we speak the same language, we don't always mean what we say. So, we speak in an ironical way, we speak metaphorically, we also speak in an inferential way. For example, I say, do you watch Big Bang Theory? And you said, I never watch sitcom. So I need to understand.
So you need to understand what I'm saying is not just this, but what does that mean?
That's
what is a sitcom?
Exactly.
What's interesting here, so if we're talking politically, and this is where things can get very difficult, we have an example where, for instance, the Chinese embassy presented, apparently, a list of what was seen as demands for what Australia should acquiesce to, 14 demands. Are they or are they requests? How would that be interpreted in Chinese?
Yes, you touch on a very important point because translation especially involves the political content, and then the sensitivities is definitely there, and the precision is very important. Chinese language is very different from English in the expression, especially in the way we speak. For example, we say, 你要什么? If you translate, yes, exactly. But that's not in English what you want, because in English you say what you want is quite rude and abrupt. But in Chinese, it's a perfect way. It's not the same. So, if you translate into English, you should translate what would you like. And that would be what the Chinese meant.
And this can get difficult, can't it, if we're dealing at a politically sensitive time right now, where there is a great deal of confrontation. And one of the issues is the inability to find a language to speak to each other, to find a diplomatic language, to talk through these hardening differences. How much more difficult is that when you're not actually speaking the same language and you're having to translate?
Huge difference, because the first requirement is really proficiency in the language, because to understand what is meant requires the language proficiency, the knowledge of the language you translate from. And then you also need to have understanding of the contextual information. And then you have to register the cognitive environment of your target language. So without understanding much of the source language, and then you think that you can translate it, you will definitely get it wrong.
I'm just wondering too, before you mentioned target, when you were talking about the no standing sign, it was meant for the bus driver. But if you hear a Xi Jinping speech, and he'll be using quite strong, threatening language when it comes to things like Taiwan, for instance, or Chinese sovereignty. Is that being meant for his target audience in China, or is that meant for the West? Would he use different language if he was talking to different audiences?
Well, that's another very interesting part that you touched on. I think, especially in China, mainland China, they often what they call internal communication is not distinguished with external communication. So they don't always have separate audiences, when they speak to the internal audience or when they speak to the external international audience, which they should. So often when they speak to the international audience, they are actually addressing their
internal,
yes,
for nationalistic purposes.
That's right.
In your own work, one of the things that you do is translate Australian works of literature, because that's what you studied, into Mandarin, into Chinese. How do you approach that when you're dealing with idioms, or when you're dealing with even culturally specific language within English? I know that one of the texts that you translated was Melissa Lukashenko, an Indigenous writer, and her book Too Much Lip, which is using a lot of Aboriginal English and Aboriginal idiom. How do you approach something when you're getting down to that granular level?
Yes, that's another very important challenge that you face. Is first of all, you do need to understand the origin language. That's Melissa Lukashenko's language, which, as you mentioned, is very colloquial Australian and also very colloquial Indigenous language. So it's really thorough understanding every aspect are covered. And then I think how Chinese would say in the same context or about the same issue or about the same thing, and then form with the Chinese way of saying it.
Do you see your work really as being able to bring people together? One of the things you said earlier was that you're not doing a literal translation, but you're trying to give a meaning or a feeling of the meaning. Do you see this work as actually connecting people as much as words?
Absolutely. I think the reason why If You Are the One is so popular in Australia, people love that show, is because they feel like they can relate to Chinese young people and what they feel, how they feel, what their life stories. It's all through translation, and through translation in a very much maneuvered way. And it's translated what is meant and how they express it in Chinese, and then how do we actually express it in English. And in the same way about Melissa Lukashenko's novel, and I do have readers who said to me, oh, I feel like Melissa speaks Chinese to me. It's really touching. So, and I think not just translating, these days, especially media and with the Google translation or machine translation, people have a simplistic view of translation or language. The way we speak, we communicate, it's actually very intriguing and it's very fascinating. Human invention is the biggest one is language. It is because we never speak the way that we literally speaking.